some losses cut so deep they change who we are forever. For Eli McCrae, losing his wife 3 years ago meant choosing a life of solitude in his remote Montana cabin, believing his heart was too broken to love again. One frozen morning, he finds a dying puppy on his doorstep. The little one is barely breathing, and Eli knows what he has to do. But as he prepares to end the pup's suffering, something amazing happens. The puppy lifts its head and gently nuzzles his face. Then Eli sees a white mark on the dog's paw that looks exactly like his childhood dog, who disappeared in a snowstorm 40 years ago. Could this be more than just coincidence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence of the Montana wilderness had become Eli McCrae's closest companion over the past 3 years. At 58, his weathered hands bore the calluses of 3 decades spent as a park ranger, and his steel-gray beard framed a face that had seen too much loss for one lifetime. The cabin he built with Sarah 25 years ago sat nestled against the base of Copper Mountain, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets only the wind could understand. Every morning followed the same ritual. Coffee at 5:30, black and strong enough to wake the dead. A glance at the empty chair across from him, where Sarah used to sit with her herbal tea and morning crossword puzzle. Then, the daily inspection of his small domain, checking the solar panels, splitting firewood, tending to the generator that kept his modest life running smoothly. The cabin itself told the story of a love that had weathered seasons and storms. Sarah's touches remained everywhere. The hand-quilted curtains in the kitchen window, the collection of vintage mason jars lined up on open shelves, the reading nook by the stone fireplace where she'd spent countless evenings lost in mystery. Novels. Eli had left everything exactly as she'd arranged it, as if maintaining the space might somehow bring back the woman who'd made it home. Their marriage had been built on shared silences and complementary strengths. While Eli navigated the rugged wilderness with the confidence of a man born to it, Sarah had been the social navigator, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversary dates, who insisted they attend the annual town harvest festival, even when Eli would have preferred the company of trees to people. She'd been the bridge between his solitary nature and the community that respected him, but rarely saw him. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent his career helping lost souls find their way through the wilderness, only to lose himself completely when Sarah's cancer took her during what should have been their golden years. The diagnosis had come suddenly: stage 4 pancreatic cancer, with a prognosis measured in months, not years. They talked about traveling, about finally taking that trip to Alaska they'd always planned. Instead, they'd spend her final months in and out of hospitals, watching hope fade like autumn leaves. After the funeral, Eli had returned to his ranger station for exactly 1 week. The concerned looks from colleagues, the careful way people spoke around him, the weight of condolences that felt more like stones in his chest. It had all become unbearable. He'd submitted his resignation letter on a Friday and hadn't looked back. The wooden box on his bedroom dresser held Sarah's wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin by decades of wear. Sometimes, in the quiet evening hours, he'd hold it up to the lamplight and remember the day he'd slipped it onto her finger in the tiny chapel in Kalispell. She'd been 26 then, radiant in her grandmother's altered wedding dress, full of dreams about the children they'd raise and the life they'd built together. The children had never come. 3 miscarriages over 10 years had taught them both that some dreams weren't meant to be fulfilled in the way you expected. Instead of the bustling household they'd imagined, they'd poured their parental energy into the wilderness itself, into the countless hikers and campers who'd sought Eli's guidance over the years. Sarah had insisted that every lost soul who found their way back safely was, in a sense, one of their children. Now, As Eli knelt beside the barely breathing puppy on his front porch, those words came back to him with startling clarity. The little creature couldn't weigh more than 8 pounds, its golden fur matted with ice crystals and dirt. Hypothermia had already set in, Eli could tell by the shallow breathing, and the way the puppy's body temperature felt cold, even through his gloves. His ranger training kicked in automatically. First priority, warmth. He gathered the puppy gently, noting the way it didn't resist or even whimper at being moved. That was never a good sign. Inside the cabin, he wrapped the little body in one of Sarah's old wool blankets, the same blankets she'd used during her final weeks when the chemo had left her perpetually cold. The puppy's eyes were closed, but Eli could see the rapid flutter of its chest as it fought for each breath. He'd dealt with hypothermic animals before during his ranger days, knew that warming had to happen gradually or the shock could be fatal. He positioned the bundle near the fireplace, not too close, just enough to raise the ambient temperature. Slowly, as he knelt there, watching for any sign of improvement, Eli found himself talking to the unconscious animal. "Where did you come from, little one? How long have you been out there?" His voice, unused to conversation, sounded rusty even to his own ears. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down the mountain road. The chances of a puppy this young surviving even a single night in the wilderness were virtually non-existent. Yet here it was, still clinging to life with a determination that reminded Eli uncomfortably of Sarah's final weeks. That same stubborn refusal to let go without a fight. He prepared a warm sugar water solution, the kind he'd learned to make for dehydrated wildlife, and managed to get a few drops between the puppy's lips using an eyedropper from his first aid kit. The liquid seemed to revive something in the animal because, for the first time since he'd found it, the puppy's eyes fluttered open. They were the most remarkable eyes Eli had ever seen on a dog deep, amber with flecks of gold that seemed to catch and hold the firelight. But it was what happened next that stopped his heart completely. Despite its obvious weakness, despite being barely conscious just moments before, the puppy somehow found the strength to lift its tiny head and press its cold nose against Eli's cheek in what could only be described as a deliberate gesture of affection. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it lasted just long enough for Eli to feel the first crack in the emotional armor he'd built around his heart. Then he saw it, the distinctive white marking on the puppy's right front paw, shaped like a perfect star with irregular edges that created a pattern as unique as a fingerprint. His breath caught in his throat. The marking was identical, absolutely. Identical to one he hadn't thought about in decades. Scout, his childhood companion, had worn that exact same star on his right front paw. Scout, who disappeared into a Christmas Eve blizzard in 1975 when Eli was just 12 years old. Scout, whose memory he buried so deep that seeing this marking now felt like a physical blow. "That's not possible," he whispered to the puppy, who seemed to regard him with those extraordinary eyes, as if it understood perfectly well what he was seeing. "You can't be." But even as his rational mind rejected the impossibility, Eli felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was gone forever. Not just hope, that was too simple a word. It was recognition, the kind that happens when two souls acknowledge each other across time and circumstance. The puppy's breathing had stabilized, and some color was returning to its gums. Whatever else this was, whatever impossible connection his mind was trying to make, the immediate priority was clear. This little life was depending on him. For the first time in 3 years, something other than grief was asking for space in Eli McCrae's carefully guarded heart. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding him that winter in the Montana mountains didn't offer second chances. But inside the cabin, warmed by firelight and filled with the soft sound of a puppy's steadying breath, something that had been frozen solid was beginning, ever so slowly, to thaw. The decision came to Eli in the quiet hours before dawn, while he sat watch over the sleeping puppy. He'd been prepared to do what seemed merciful just hours before, but something had shifted in the night. The little creature's breathing had grown stronger, more regular, and twice Eli had caught those amber eyes, watching him with an intelligence that seemed far beyond what any puppy should possess. "We're going to town," he announced to the puppy, who lifted its head as if it had been waiting for exactly those words. Dr. Morrison might think I've lost my mind, but she's seen stranger things than an old hermit with a half-frozen dog. The drive down the mountain took 45 minutes on roads that hadn't seen maintenance since the last snow. Eli's pickup truck, a reliable Ford that Sarah had insisted they buy because it matches your stubborn personality, handled the winding descent with familiar ease. The puppy rode in a cardboard box on the passenger seat, wrapped in blankets and occasionally making soft sounds that weren't quite whimpers, more like conversations with something Eli couldn't see. Whitefish Valley Animal Clinic sat on the outskirts of town, a modest building that Dr. Helen Morrison had been running for 23 years. She treated everything from prize-winning horses to exotic pets that tourists brought through during the summer months. If anyone could make sense of what Eli had found, it would be Helen. She met them at the door, her silver hair pulled back in its usual practical ponytail, and her green eyes immediately focused on the bundle in Eli's arms. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, which was about as close to profanity as Helen Morrison ever came. "Eli McCrae, in my clinic with a patient that isn't himself for once. Found him on my doorstep," Eli said simply. "Thought he was dying, but he's got more fight in him than I expected." Helen's examination was thorough and gentle. She checked the puppy's temperature, listened to its heart, examined its eyes and gums. "Remarkable," she murmured after several minutes. "Based on what you describe, this little one should be showing signs of serious hypothermia damage, possibly frostbite. Instead, his vital signs are stronger than some healthy puppies I see for routine checkups. So, he'll make it." "More than that," Helen said, scratching behind the puppy's ears and receiving a tail wag in response. "I'd say he's going to thrive. Golden Retriever mix, probably 8 to 10 weeks old. Someone either abandoned him or he wandered off and got lost. Either way, you saved his life, Eli." The word abandoned hit something deep in Eli's chest. He thought of Scout, thought of the night his childhood dog had disappeared, thought of all the ways that love could be lost through carelessness or circumstances beyond anyone's control. "What do I need to do?" He heard himself asking. Helen looked up from her examination, eyebrows raised. "You're keeping him?" "I don't know," Eli admitted. "Maybe. What would I need to do?" "Well, they'll need vaccinations, proper food, probably some socialization. Puppies are a lot of work, Eli. They need attention, training, companionship. Are you ready for that?" A question hung in the air between them. Eli looked down at the puppy, who was now sitting calmly on the examination table, those remarkable amber eyes fixed on his face with what looked remarkably like patience, or trust, or both. "I'll figure it out," he said. The drive home was different from the trip down. The puppy, he needed a name. Eli realized rode loose in the cab now, occasionally padding over to sniff at Eli's elbow or look out the window at the passing landscape. There was something about the way the little dog watched the familiar mountain roads that bothered Eli, something almost like recognition. Back at the cabin, Eli found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, searching through old belongings. The basement held boxes of memories that he'd avoided since Sarah's death. But tonight something was pulling him down those wooden steps into the musty space beneath the cabin. The box he was looking for sat in the far corner, labeled in Sarah's careful handwriting, "Eli's childhood things." Inside, beneath old baseball cards and a collection of arrowheads he'd found as a boy, was the leather journal his mother had given him for his 10th birthday. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with the earnest handwriting of a child documenting his adventures. Most entries were short. Found a hawk feather today, or Dad taught me to tie a bowling knot. But as Eli flipped through the pages, he found what he was looking for. December 24th, 1975. The entry was longer than most, written in the careful script of a 12-year-old trying to capture something important. Scout got out tonight during the blizzard. I forgot to latch the door tight, and he must have pushed it open. The dad and me looked for 2 hours, but the snow was too deep and it was too dark. Mom made me come inside, but I keep listening for him to bark. Scout has a white star on his right front paw that looks like the ones we put on top of the Christmas tree. He's the best dog anyone ever had, and I should have been more careful. I hope he found somewhere warm to wait out the storm. I hope he comes home tomorrow. The next entry was dated January 15th. Still no Scout. Dad says he probably found a new family somewhere, but I think something bad happened. I should have checked the door. It's my fault he's gone. Eli's hand shook as he read his own words from 4 decades ago. The guilt had been crushing for a 12-year-old boy, the kind of self-blame that shapes how you see yourself for years to come. He'd never owned another dog after Scout disappeared. Some losses, he'd told himself, were too great to risk experiencing again. The puppy had followed him down to the basement and now sat quietly beside the open box, as if waiting for Eli to make the connection that was becoming impossible to ignore. Those amber eyes seemed to hold depths of understanding that defied explanation. Scout, Eli said quietly, testing the name. The puppy's tail wagged once, deliberately, as if in approval. That night, Eli made a bed for Scout near the fireplace, using old blankets and a pillow that still held the faintest trace of Sarah's lavender perfume. As he watched the puppy settle into sleep, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond simple survival. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in the hard realities of wilderness survival and scientific observation, insisted that what he was thinking was impossible. Dogs didn't come back from the dead. White markings on paws weren't unique. Coincidences, however remarkable, were still just coincidences. But as Eli sat in his chair by the fireplace, watching Scout's peaceful breathing in the golden light of the flames, he found that the rational part of his mind was being drowned out by something much stronger. The possibility that love, in whatever form it takes, might be more persistent and more mysterious than he'd ever dared to believe. Outside, the Montana wind continued its ancient conversation with the pine trees. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 3 years, Eli McCrae wasn't entirely alone. The transformation began with small things. Scout's recovery over the following week was nothing short of remarkable. Within 3 days, he was eating solid food with the enthusiasm of a healthy puppy, and by the end of the week, he was following Eli around the cabin with the confidence of a dog who knew exactly where he belonged. It was Scout's uncanny familiarity with the cabin layout that first made Eli's scientific skepticism begin to waver. The puppy navigated the space as if he'd lived there for years, never bumping into furniture, never hesitating at doorways. More unsettling still was the way Scout seemed to know Eli's routines, appearing in the kitchen precisely at coffee time, settling by the fireplace exactly when Eli sat down with his evening book, somehow always positioning himself in the spots where sunlight would stream through the windows at different times of day. "You're acting like you own the place," Eli muttered on the 4th morning, watching Scout pad confidently toward the back door at exactly the moment Eli typically went outside to split firewood. The puppy sat and waited, tail wagging, as if he'd been making this same trip for years. The resemblance to his childhood Scout grew stronger each day. It wasn't just the white star marking on the paw, though, that remained as perfectly identical as a fingerprint match. It was the way Scout tilted his head when listening, the particular manner in which he stretched after naps, the habit of sitting with his back pressed against Eli's leg when they were outside together. Even Scout's sleeping position was achingly familiar, curled into a tight circle with his nose tucked under his tail, exactly as the original Scout had slept 4 decades ago. On Saturday morning, restless energy drove Eli to tackle a project he'd been avoiding for months. The cabin's attic held decades of accumulated belongings, Christmas decorations, old camping gear, boxes of books that Sarah had insisted on keeping just in case. Scout followed him up the narrow ladder, moving with a sure-footedness that seemed impossible for such a young dog. The attic smelled of cedar and dust and time itself. Eli worked methodically through boxes, sorting items for donation or disposal, when Scout began whining softly near a corner that Eli hadn't yet reached. The puppy was pawing at a cardboard box marked Garage Sale 1987 in Sarah's handwriting. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked, making his way over. Inside the box, beneath a collection of kitchen gadgets they'd apparently decided not to sell, was something that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. A red leather collar, small and worn, with brass studs that had tarnished to a dull gold. The leather was soft with age, but remarkably well preserved, as if it had been waiting in that box for exactly this moment. On the inside of the collar, in his father's careful block letters, was the name Scout and their old phone number from the house in Kalispell where Eli had grown up. "This can't be right," Eli whispered, turning the collar over in his hands. He remembered his father making this collar in the garage workshop, remembered the smell of leather dye and the sound of the punch creating holes for the buckle. The collar had disappeared the same night Scout they'd assumed it had come off, somewhere in the woods during the dog's desperate attempt to find his way home. Scout sat perfectly still as Eli examined the collar, those amber eyes watching, with what looked remarkably like patience or expectation. When Eli finally looked down at him, the puppy's tail wagged once as if in encouragement. The collar fit perfectly. Not approximately, not close enough perfectly, as if it had been sized for this exact dog, despite being made 40 years ago for an entirely different animal. The brass studs sat in precisely the right positions. The buckle closed at exactly the right hole, and the weight of it around Scout's neck seemed to settle something in both dog and man. "This is impossible," Eli said aloud, but his voice lacked conviction. Scout responded by padding over to an old mirror leaning against the attic wall, sitting in front of it as if admiring his reflection, or perhaps remembering something Eli couldn't see. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived down the mountain road and occasionally checked on Eli during the winter months, arrived in her ancient Subaru with a casserole dish and the determined expression of someone on a mission. "Eli McCrae, you look 10 years younger," she announced before he could even greet her properly. Dorothy Patterson was 73, had raised 6 children and outlived 2 husbands, and possessed the kind of direct honesty that came from a lifetime of not having time for nonsense. "What's gotten into you?" Scout appeared at Eli's side, and Dorothy's expression immediately softened. "Well, hello there, handsome. Where did you come from?" "Found him on my doorstep about a week ago," Eli explained. "Half frozen, barely alive. Figured I'd try to nurse him back to health." Dorothy knelt down, and Scout immediately went to her, tail wagging and accepting her attention with the social grace of a dog who'd been properly socialized. "He's beautiful, Eli. And look at you. You're actually smiling. I haven't seen that in 3 years." It was true. Eli hadn't realized it, but the constant weight in his chest had lessened over the past week. He was sleeping better, eating regular meals instead of surviving on coffee and whatever happened to be available. The cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a home. "Dogs have a way of bringing out the best in people," Dorothy continued, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Sarah always said you needed another dog after that childhood one you lost. What was his name?" Scout, Eli said quietly. Dorothy looked up sharply. You named this one Scout? After your first dog? It seemed to fit. Dorothy studied both man and dog for a long moment. Well, I'll be. Life has a funny way of coming full circle sometimes, doesn't it? This little fellow has good energy. I can feel it. After Dorothy left, Eli sat on his porch with Scout beside him, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks. The puppy's behavior continued to puzzle him. Scout seemed to know exactly when Eli was about to stand up, when he was thinking about going inside, when he needed the simple comfort of a warm body pressed against his leg. What are you, really? Eli asked quietly. Scout looked up at him with those remarkable amber eyes, and for just a moment, Eli could have sworn he saw something ancient and knowing looking back at him. Not the blank innocence of a 10-week-old puppy, but the patient wisdom of a soul that had traveled a very long way to be exactly where it was supposed to be. The rational explanations were becoming harder to maintain. Coincidences could only stretch so far before they began to look like something else entirely. As the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, Eli found himself seriously considering possibilities that would have seemed absurd just a week ago. Maybe love really was stronger than death. Maybe some bonds were too deep to be broken by something as simple as time. The similarities became impossible to ignore when Eli discovered the photographs. 2 weeks after finding Scout, a restless Sunday afternoon had driven him to tackle the basement storage room, a project Sarah had nagged him about for years before her illness made such concerns seem trivial. Box after box yielded forgotten treasures. Sarah's high school yearbooks, their honeymoon photos from Glacier National Park, Christmas cards from friends they'd lost touch with decades ago. It was in a shoebox labeled Eli Childhood, but he found the manila envelope containing his mother's old Polaroid snapshots. The photos were faded to the sepia tones of memory, but the images were clear enough to make Eli's hands tremble as he sorted through them. There he was at age 12, grinning gap-toothed at the camera with his arm around a golden retriever puppy. The dog in the photo wore the same red leather collar Scout now carried, but more startling still was the identical white star marking on the right front paw. Not similar identical. The same irregular edges, the same distinctive pattern that looked like a constellation map viewed through a child's telescope. Scout had followed him down to the basement and now sat quietly beside the storage boxes, occasionally sniffing at particular photographs as Eli examined them. When Eli held up the clearest picture of himself with the original Scout, the puppy's tail wagged with what looked remarkably like recognition. "Look at this," Eli whispered, showing Scout the photograph. "That's you, isn't it?" "Somehow, impossibly, that's you." Scout's response was to gently take the corner of the photograph in his mouth, not to chew or damage it, but to hold it with the careful delicacy of a retriever trained to handle fragile game birds. The gesture was so deliberate, so purposeful, that Eli felt the last of his scientific skepticism begin to crumble. That evening, for the first time in years, Eli found himself researching something that had nothing to do with wilderness survival or practical mountain living. Sarah's old laptop, dusty from disuse, connected to the cabin's satellite internet with the slow patience of rural technology. His search terms felt foolish even as he typed them. Dog reincarnation, animal spirits returning, pets coming back after death. The results were a mixture of New Age philosophy, religious speculation, and surprisingly serious academic discussion about animal consciousness and the nature of identity. One article, published in a veterinary psychology journal, discussed cases of pets exhibiting behaviors and preferences identical to deceased animals they could never have encountered. Another explored indigenous beliefs about animal spirits choosing to return to complete, unfinished emotional bonds. Scout lay curled against Eli's feet as he read, occasionally shifting position, but never leaving his side. The puppy's presence was deeply comforting in a way that Eli couldn't quite explain. Not just the simple companionship of a pet, but something more profound. Like the return of a missing piece of himself he'd forgotten was gone. The breakthrough came 3 days later during their morning walk. Eli had been taking Scout on increasingly longer expeditions around the cabin, partly for the puppy's socialization and exercise, but mostly because Scout seemed to know exactly where he wanted to go. The dog would choose directions with confidence, patting down familiar trails as if following a map only he could see. On this particular morning, Scout led Eli to a spot he hadn't visited in over a decade, a small clearing beside Willow Creek, where he and Sarah used to picnic during their early years in the cabin. Sarah had called it their secret place, though it was less than half a mile from home. The clearing held a weathered wooden bench that Eli had built during their second summer there, positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun and overlook the creek's gentle rapids. Scout ran directly to the bench and sat beside it, looking up at Eli with an expression that was unmistakably expectant. This was where Eli had scattered Sarah's ashes 3 years ago, following her request to rest in the place where they'd shared so many quiet moments together. "You know about Sarah, don't you?" Eli asked quietly. Scout's tail wagged once, gently, and the puppy moved to press against Eli's leg in a gesture of comfort that was exactly what the original Scout used to do whenever 12-year-old Eli had been sad or upset. The memory hit him with startling clarity. Scout, the first Scout, had always known when Eli needed comfort. The dog had possessed an uncanny ability to appear whenever Eli was struggling with something: a failed test at school, an argument with his parents, the particular loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed sensitive children. Scout had been more than a pet. He'd been a companion in the truest sense, a being who seemed to understand Eli's emotional landscape with intuitive precision. This Scout, this impossible Scout, was demonstrating the exact same understanding. He'd led Eli to Sarah's resting place not by accident, but because somehow he knew it was important. Somehow he understood that Eli needed to connect this spot with his growing acceptance of the extraordinary. Mrs. Patterson arrived again that afternoon, this time with a purpose beyond simple neighborly checking. "Eli," she said without preamble, "I've been thinking about that dog of yours. There's something special about him. Something that goes beyond normal." "What do you mean?" Dorothy settled into one of the porch chairs, and Scout immediately went to her, resting his head on her knee with the natural affection of a dog who understood that this woman was a friend. "I've been around animals my whole life," she said, stroking Scout's ears. "Horses, cattle, working dogs, pets. You develop a sense for these things. This little fellow has what my grandmother used to call an old soul. He's been here before, Eli. I'd stake my life on it." "That's impossible." "Is it?" Dorothy's eyes were serious, holding none of the casual warmth she usually displayed. "My grandmother was half Blackfoot. She used to tell stories about spirits who returned in animal form to help the people they loved. Said the Creator sometimes allowed it when there was unfinished business between souls." Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Unfinished business? Think about it," Dorothy said gently. "You lost your first dog when you were just a boy. Blamed yourself for it, didn't you? Carried that guilt for decades. Then Sarah dies, and you lock yourself away from everyone who cares about you. Maybe," she paused, watching Scout's intelligent eyes, "maybe some souls love so deeply that they find a way to come back when their people need them most." That night, as Eli sat by the fireplace with Scout sleeping peacefully beside him, he found himself having the first real conversation he'd attempted in 3 years. Not with another person, but with the universe itself, with whatever force might be listening to the prayers of a grieving man who was slowly beginning to believe in impossible things. "If you really are my Scout," he said quietly, "if you somehow found your way back to me, Then you should know that losing you was the first time I learned that love could hurt. But Sarah taught me that love was worth the risk anyway. I don't know how any of this is possible, but I'm grateful. More grateful than I know how to say. Scout opened one amber eye, looked directly at Eli with an expression of perfect understanding, and settled back into sleep with what looked remarkably like a contented smile. The maps came out on a Tuesday morning when Eli was searching for his old compass in the kitchen junk drawer. Scout had been restless all morning, pacing near the front door and whining softly, not the demanding whine of a puppy needing to go outside, but something more purposeful, almost urgent. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked, but Scout simply patted over to the cabinet where Eli kept his extensive collection of topographical maps. The puppy sat down and stared at the cabinet door with laser focus. Tail wagging expectantly. Eli had accumulated dozens of maps during his 30-year career as a park ranger, detailed surveys of every trail, creek, and landmark within a 100-mile radius of the cabin. Some were official U.S. Geological Survey maps. Others were hand-drawn sketches he'd made of hidden spots known only to locals. He'd been obsessive about documenting the wilderness, partly for professional reasons, but mostly because mapping the unknown had always satisfied something deep in his soul. He pulled out the map collection and spread several across the kitchen table. Scout immediately jumped onto a chair of behavior Eli hadn't taught him, and began sniffing at specific locations on the maps with deliberate precision. "You recognize these?" Eli asked, watching in fascination as Scout's nose traced familiar patterns across the paper. The puppy paused at certain marked locations, tail wagging more vigorously at some spots than others. One map in particular seemed to capture Scout's attention, a hand-drawn sketch of the area around Copper Mountain that Eli had created during his early 20s, long before he'd met Sarah. Red X marks indicated special locations, fishing spots, wildlife viewing areas, hidden campsites that only the most experienced hikers ever found. Several of these marks had small notations in his younger handwriting. Scout's favorite swimming hole. Best Huckleberry Patch Scout always finds them first. Scout's lookout point. Eli stared at the notations, his heart beginning to race. He'd completely forgotten about these annotations, made during the summers when he'd worked as a seasonal ranger and brought the original Scout on his backcountry patrols. Those had been magical times. Just a young man and his dog exploring wilderness that felt infinite and full of possibility. Scout was now pawing gently at one specific marking on the map. A red X beside Willow Creek, about 2 miles upstream from the cabin. The notation read, "Scout's Secret Cave Winter 1976. Eli remembered that discovery vividly now. Scout had led him to a shallow cave, hidden behind a curtain of ice-covered willow branches. A perfect shelter where they'd waited out an unexpected snowstorm during a winter hike. "You want to go there, don't you?" Eli said. Scout's entire body wiggled with excitement, and he jumped down from the chair to pace toward the front door again. The hike to the cave would normally take about an hour, but Scout knew the way with such precision that they made it in 40 minutes. The puppy didn't follow Eli, he led, choosing every turn, every shortcut, every stream crossing with the confidence of someone who'd traveled this route countless times before. The cave was exactly as Eli remembered it, though smaller than his childhood memory had made it seem. The opening was partially hidden by winter bare willow branches, and inside, the space was just large enough for a man and a dog to shelter comfortably. But what stopped Eli's breath was what he found carved into the soft sandstone wall. EM plus Scout 1976, scratched into the rock with his boy Scout knife during that long-ago winter storm. Scout padded directly to the carving and sat beneath it, looking up at Eli with those remarkable amber eyes. The message was unmistakable. "I remember." I was here. This is our place. How is this possible? Eli whispered, running his fingers over the decades-old carving. How can you remember something that happened to a different dog in a different lifetime? Scout's response was to move deeper into the cave, to a spot where Eli had once built a small fire ring from gathered stones. The rocks were still there, blackened from ancient fires, and Scout curled up beside them exactly as the original Scout had done 46 years ago. The memories came flooding back then, not just of that particular storm, but of dozens of adventures he and Scout had shared during those precious years when they'd both been young, and the world had seemed infinite with possibility. They'd hiked every trail within 50 miles of Kalispell, camped under stars that seemed close enough to touch, shared the kind of wordless companionship that only exists between a boy and his dog Dot. It was in this cave. During that 1976 snowstorm, that 12-year-old Eli had made a promise he'd completely forgotten until this moment. Sitting by the fire with Scout pressed against his side, watching snow pile up outside their shelter, he'd sworn that he and Scout would be best friends forever, that nothing would ever separate them, that even death wouldn't be strong enough to break their bond. I promised you we'd always be together, Eli said aloud, the words emerging from a place deeper than conscious memory. Even when I was old and you were old, I promised we'd find each other again. Scout's tail thumped against the cave floor, and he moved to press his warm body against Eli's leg in the exact gesture of comfort and companionship that had sustained a lonely boy through that long-ago storm. The hike back to the cabin was different from the journey out. Eli felt lighter somehow, as if acknowledging the impossible had released him from the exhausting effort of denial. Scout trotted beside him with obvious contentment, occasionally running ahead to investigate interesting scents, but always returning to check that. Eli was following Dot as they approached the cabin. Eli realized that something fundamental had shifted during their expedition to the cave. For 3 years, he'd been living in a state of emotional suspension, neither fully alive nor completely surrendered to grief. But Scout's presence and the growing acceptance of what Scout represented was calling him back to engagement with life. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Eli found himself talking to Scout about Sarah, about his years as a ranger, about dreams he'd abandoned and regrets he'd carried. Scout listened with the perfect attention that only dogs possess, occasionally offering a gentle paw on Eli's knee or shifting position to maintain physical contact. "You came back for a reason," Eli said finally. "I don't understand how or why, but I'm starting to believe that some connections really are stronger than death. The question is, what am I supposed to do with this gift?" Scout's answer was to rest his head in Eli's lap and look up at him with eyes that held depths of patience and wisdom. The message was clear. You'll know when you're ready. For now, it's enough that you're no longer alone. Outside, the Montana wind sang its ancient songs through the pine trees. But inside the cabin, 2 old souls who had found each other across time and impossible circumstances settled into the peaceful silence of perfect understanding. The discovery came while Eli was looking for Sarah's favorite reading glasses, the one she'd insisted on keeping for emergencies, even after her prescription had changed. Scout had been acting strangely all morning, repeatedly going to Sarah's side of the bedroom and whining softly at the closed dresser drawers, behavior that finally prompted Eli to investigate what the dog seemed to be trying to tell him. In the bottom drawer of Sarah's antique mahogany dresser, beneath carefully folded sweaters that still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume, Eli found a manila envelope he'd never seen before. His name was written across the front in Sarah's distinctive handwriting, along with a note, "For Eli when you're ready to live again." Inside the envelope were documents that made Eli's hands shake as he read them. Medical records from Sarah's fertility specialist, test results from procedures she'd never mentioned, and consultation notes spanning nearly 5 years of secret treatments. The papers told a story he'd never known. Sarah's private battle with infertility had been far more extensive and heartbreaking than she'd ever let him understand. But it was the letter at the bottom of the envelope that broke his heart completely. "Open. My dearest Eli," it began in Sarah's careful script. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you finally found the courage to go through my things properly. I hid these papers because I never wanted you to know how desperately I tried to give you children, or how much it cost us financially and emotionally when the treatments failed." The letter went on to detail years of hope and disappointment, of procedures attempted while Eli was away on extended ranger assignments, of a woman who'd wanted nothing more than to fill their home with the laughter of children, who would have their father's gentle strength and adventurous spirit. "But here's what I learned through all of that heartache." The letter continued. "Love doesn't require the shape we expect it to take. You filled my life so completely that I never felt truly empty, even when my body couldn't give us the family we planned. The wilderness was our child, Eli. Every lost hiker you guided home, every injured animal you nursed back to health, every young ranger you mentored, those were all acts of fathering, even if you never called them that." Scout sat quietly beside Eli as he read, occasionally pressing his warm body against Eli's leg when the words became too difficult to bear. The puppy's presence was deeply comforting, as if he understood the importance of this moment and wanted to offer whatever support he could. The final section of the letter was what undid Eli completely. "I need you to know that my greatest fear isn't dying, it's leaving you alone. You have so much love to give, so much wisdom to share, but you'll try to lock it all away when I'm gone. Please don't do that, my darling. Find someone or something that needs your care. Open your heart again, even if it feels impossible. Promise me you'll choose life over solitude, love over safety. The world needs what you have to offer, and you deserve the joy that comes from caring for something beyond yourself." The letter was dated 6 months before Sarah's death, written during one of her clearer periods when the cancer treatment still allowed for planning and hope. At the bottom, she'd added a postscript that made Eli laugh and cry simultaneously. "Bess, I've always believed that Scout found his way back to you once, and I have faith he'll do it again when you need him most. Some loves are just too strong for death to break." Eli set the letter down with trembling hands, looking at Scout with new understanding. "She knew, didn't she? Somehow Sarah knew you'd come back." Scout's tail wagged gently, and he moved to rest his head in Eli's lap with the patient tenderness of a being who understood grief from both sides, the one who leaves and the one who's left behind. That afternoon brought an emotional breakthrough that had been building for weeks. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Eli allowed himself to cry not the bitter tears of anger and self-pity that had sustained him through the worst of his grief, but the cleansing tears of acceptance and gratitude. Scout stayed with him through it all, offering the same intuitive comfort he'd provided to 12-year-old Eli during childhood sorrows. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Eli felt lighter than he had in years, as if Sarah's letter had given him permission to live again without betraying her memory. "You know what she'd say if she could see us now?" Eli asked Scout, scratching behind the dog's ears. "She'd say it's about time I stopped hiding from the world. She'd probably have a whole list of things I need to do to rejoin the human race." The decision came to him gradually over the following days. Sarah's letter had planted a seed, but it was Scout's constant, loving presence that helped it grow into something actionable. If love really could transcend death, if Scout's return was proof that some bonds were stronger than the grave, then maybe Eli's responsibility wasn't to preserve his grief like a sacred relic, but to honor it by choosing to care again. He started with a phone call to his brother David in Colorado, a conversation he'd been avoiding for nearly 2 years. David had stopped calling after Eli's increasingly curt responses made it clear that sympathy wasn't welcome. But their relationship had been strong enough to survive worse things than grief-induced rudeness. Eli? David's voice was cautious. Surprised. Everything okay? I got a dog, Eli said, which wasn't what he'd planned to say, but felt like the most important news he had to share. You got a dog? The surprise in David's voice was genuine. That's great, Eli. What kind? Golden. Retriever mix. Named Scout. Found him half frozen on my doorstep about a month ago. Scout, David repeated thoughtfully. Like your childhood dog? Exactly like my childhood dog, Eli said, and found himself smiling at the understatement. David, I know I haven't been good company since Sarah died, but I think I'm ready to try being human again. The conversation lasted 2 hours, the longest Eli had talked to anyone in 3 years. David listened without judgment as Eli shared carefully edited versions of the past month's revelations, focusing on Scout's healing presence rather than the supernatural elements that might sound like grief-induced delusion. You sound different, David said finally. More like the brother I remember. Maybe I should come visit this spring. Meet this miracle dog of yours. I'd like that, Eli said, and meant it. I'd really like that. That night, as Scout settled into his usual sleeping spot by the fireplace, Eli felt something he'd thought was gone forever. Anticipation for the future. Not the desperate hope that had sustained him through Sarah's illness, but a quiet confidence that tomorrow might hold possibilities worth exploring. Thank you, he said quietly, addressing both Scout and Sarah and whatever force in the universe had conspired to bring healing to a broken heart. Thank you for not giving up on me. The phone call from Dr. Morrison came on a Thursday morning while Eli was splitting firewood and Scout was investigating something fascinating in the nearby underbrush. The phone's shrill ring cut through the mountain silence like an alarm, and something in its urgency made Eli drop his axe and hurry inside. Eli, I need you to sit down. Helen Morrison's voice was carefully controlled, the tone she used when delivering news that would change everything. The test results on Scout came back from the lab, and we need to talk. What kind of test results? Eli asked, though his stomach was already dropping toward his boots. You said he was healthy. He's healthy, remarkably so. But Eli, I sent samples of his blood and saliva for genetic analysis as part of routine puppy screening. The results don't make sense. They literally cannot be accurate, but I've had them run 3 times by different laboratories. Eli sank into his kitchen chair, watching through the window as Scout emerged from the bushes with a stick in his mouth, tail wagging with simple joy. What did they find? Scout's DNA profile shows genetic markers from a bloodline that was discontinued 47 years ago. The specific combination of traits he carries matches records from a breeding program that ended in 1977 when the last registered dogs of that particular lineage died without producing offspring. The words seemed to echo in Eli's head without making complete sense. What does that mean exactly? It means that according to every scientific database we have access to, Scout's genetic makeup is impossible. The dogs that would have been his ancestors have been extinct for nearly half a century. There's no way he could exist with this particular DNA profile unless... Helen's voice trailed off, and Eli could hear her shuffling papers, the sound of someone looking for rational explanations in irrational data. Unless what? He prompted. Unless he's somehow genetically identical to dogs from that original bloodline. Dogs from the 1970s. Eli, I've been a veterinarian for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's as if Scout stepped out of a time capsule. After Helen hung up, promising to send him copies of all the test results, Eli sat in his kitchen staring at nothing. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in scientific observation and logical analysis, was scrambling for explanations. Laboratory errors, contaminated samples, bureaucratic mix-ups in genetic databases. But the deeper part of him, the part that had been growing stronger since Scout's arrival, whispered a different truth. This was confirmation of what he'd already known in his heart. Scout wasn't just similar to his childhood dog. Scout was his childhood dog, returned through means that science couldn't measure or explain. The test results arrived by courier the next day. 23 pages of genetic analysis that read like a scientific impossibility. Eli spread them across his kitchen table and tried to make sense of the technical language. But the conclusion was inescapable. Scout carried genetic markers that shouldn't exist in any living dog. More disturbing still was a handwritten note from the lead geneticist at the laboratory, Mr. McCrae. In 30 years of canine genetic analysis, I have never encountered results like these. Your dog's DNA profile matches exactly with archive samples from the Montana State University Veterinary Program's 1970s breeding research. I mean exactly, not similar, not close, but identical down to the molecular level. This should be impossible. I would very much like to meet this animal if you're willing to arrange it. Scout seemed to sense Eli's distress and stayed close throughout the day, occasionally resting his head on Eli's knee or offering a gentle paw when the man's agitation became too obvious. The dog's behavior was perfectly normal, perfectly puppy-like, except for those moments when his amber eyes seemed to hold depths of understanding that defied his apparent age. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Patterson arrived just after sunset, but this time she wasn't alone. The elderly woman who emerged from the passenger seat of Dorothy's car was someone Eli had never seen before, small and weathered, with steel gray hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. Eli McCrae, Dorothy said with unusual formality, "I'd like you to meet Mary Crowfeather. She's driven up from the reservation because she heard about Scout." Mary Crowfeather approached Scout with the careful respect of someone who understood that not all encounters were casual. Scout, for his part, went to her immediately, sitting calmly as she knelt down and placed both hands on his head in what looked like a blessing or recognition ceremony. "Dorothy told me about your dog," Mary said, a voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "About the markings, the behavior, the way he came to you. My grandmother would have called him a returning spirit, a soul who chose to come back because his work here wasn't finished." "His work?" Eli asked. Mary's hands remained on Scout's head as she spoke, her eyes closed as if she were listening to something Eli couldn't hear. "Animals who love deeply sometimes refuse to cross over completely when they die. They wait, watching over the people they loved until those people need them again. When the need becomes great enough, the spirit finds a way to return." "That's impossible," Eli said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mary opened her eyes and looked at him with gentle directness. "Is it? Or is it just beyond what your scientific training taught you to accept? Your culture thinks death is an ending, but my people have always known it's just a transition. Love strong enough can bridge any gap, even the one between life and death." She stood slowly, her hands leaving Scout's head reluctantly. "The returning spirits don't come back just to comfort. They come back to heal, to teach, to help their loved ones complete something that was left unfinished. This dog didn't return just for companionship, Mr. McCrae. He came back to help you find your way to something important." "What kind of something?" That's between you and him," Mary said with a slight smile. "But I will tell you this. The spirits don't have unlimited time in their borrowed bodies. When their work is done, when they've accomplished what they came back to do, they have to return to where they belong. Enjoy this gift, but don't waste it. Whatever Scout came back to help you understand, you'd better figure it out soon." After the women left, Eli sat on his porch with Scout beside him, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The genetic test results were still spread across his kitchen table. Scientific proof of something that couldn't be scientifically explained. But Mary Crowfeather's words had given him a framework for understanding that went beyond laboratory analysis. "So you really are him," Eli said quietly. "You really are my Scout, somehow given another chance to be here with me." Scout's tail wagged once, gently, and he pressed against Eli's leg with familiar warmth. "The question is," Eli continued, "what? Is it you came back to help me understand? What's the unfinished business between us?" The answer came to him gradually over the following hours, emerging from the accumulated insights of the past month. Scout hadn't just returned to comfort a grieving man. He'd returned to teach him something about the nature of love itself, about how real connection transcends physical form and individual lifetime, about how the capacity to care for others wasn't diminished by loss, but could actually be strengthened by it. Sarah's letter had asked him to open his heart again, to find someone or something that needed his care. Scout's impossible return was showing him that love, once established, never really ended. It just took new forms, found new expressions, created new opportunities for healing and growth. As the full magnitude of this understanding settled over him, Eli felt something shift in his chest, like a door that had been locked for 3 years finally swinging open. Scout's miraculous presence wasn't just about the bond between a boy and his dog, though that was part of it. It was about learning to trust that love was stronger than death, more persistent than grief, more creative in its expressions than human understanding could encompass. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Eli whispered into the mountain night. Scout looked up at him with those remarkable amber eyes, and in their depths, Eli saw not just the spirit of his childhood companion, but a reflection of every love he'd ever known and ever would know, continuing, transforming, but never truly lost. The change in Scout's behavior began subtly, 3 days after Mary Crowfeather's visit. At first, Eli attributed the dog's restlessness to spring weather. The mountain snow was beginning to melt, and the scents and sounds of awakening wilderness often made animals eager to explore. But this was different. Scout would stand at the cabin's windows for long periods, staring toward the high peaks with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something Eli couldn't perceive. More unsettling was the way Scout had begun to seek out physical contact with increasing urgency. The dog, who had always been affectionate, now seemed desperate for touch, pressing against Eli's legs during their walks, sleeping closer to his bed at night, following him from room to room with the anxious attention of someone who knew their time was limited. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked on Saturday morning, finding Scout sitting by the front door with his hiking harness in his mouth, a piece of equipment Eli hadn't used since taking up serious backcountry expeditions with Sarah years earlier. "You want to go somewhere specific?" Scout dropped the harness at Eli's feet and padded over to the kitchen table where the topographical maps still lay spread out from their previous explorations. But instead of sniffing at familiar locations, Scout placed his paw on a section of the map that Eli had never marked, a remote area high in the Copper Mountain Range, accessible only by a challenging trail that most hikers avoided. "That's a hard climb," Eli warned, studying the elevation lines and terrain markers. "Probably still snow up there this time of year. Are you sure that's where you want to go?" Scout's tail wagged with unmistakable determination, and he trotted back to the harness with the kind of focused energy that suggested this wasn't a request but an imperative. The preparation took most of the day. Eli hadn't attempted a serious backcountry expedition in over 3 years, and his gear needed careful inspection. The backpack that had carried supplies through countless wilderness adventures required new buckles and waterproof treatment. His hiking boots needed resoling. The camping equipment had to be tested and organized. But it was while gathering his cold weather gear that Eli discovered something that stopped him cold. Tucked into the pocket of his old mountaineering jacket was a small beaded pouch he'd never seen before. The craftsmanship was distinctly Native American intricate. Patterns worked in blue and white beads around a soft leather container about the size of his palm. Inside the pouch were items that seemed chosen with deliberate care. A piece of sage, a small chunk of rose quartz, a feather from what looked like a golden eagle, and a folded piece of paper with writing in two languages, English and what Eli assumed was Blackfoot. The English portion read, "For the man whose heart has learned to trust what his eyes cannot explain." This blessing pouch contained sacred items to help guide a spirit safely home when its earthly work is complete. Use them when the time comes, and trust that love never truly ends. It only changes form. There was no signature, but Eli had no doubt about who had left this gift. Mary Crow Feather had somehow placed it in his jacket during her visit, knowing that he would find it when he needed it most. The implications of the blessing pouch hit him like a physical blow. Mary had spoken about returning spirits having limited time in their borrowed bodies, about the need to complete their unfinished business before returning to where they belonged. The urgency in Scout's behavior, his desperate need for physical closeness, his insistence on this particular mountain expedition, it all suddenly made terrible sense. "You're saying goodbye, aren't you?" Eli asked a Scout that evening as they sat by the fireplace. "This trip, whatever you're trying to show me up there, it's your way of saying goodbye." Scout moved to rest his head in Eli's lap, looking up with those remarkable amber eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom and infinite love. The message was unmistakable. Yes, but not just goodbye. Completion. That night, Eli lay awake listening to Scout's peaceful breathing from the foot of his bed, trying to prepare himself emotionally for what was coming. He'd lost Scout once as a 12-year-old boy, and the grief had been devastating. Now he was going to lose him again. But this time, he understood the gift he'd been given. This time, he could say goodbye properly. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant peaks look close enough to touch. Scout waited by the door with barely contained excitement while Eli loaded their packs with enough supplies for 2 days in the backcountry. Food, water purification tablets, emergency shelter, first aid supplies, everything needed for a safe expedition into terrain that could turn deadly without warning. But Eli also packed items that had nothing to do with wilderness survival. Sarah's favorite photograph of them together, taken on their 10th wedding anniversary at Glacier National Park. The red leather collar that had belonged to the original Scout. The blessing pouch from Mary Crow Feather. His childhood journal with its innocent entries about a boy and his beloved dog. The trail began gently enough, following a well-marked path through pine forests that were just beginning to show signs of spring awakening. But after the first mile, Scout led them onto a barely visible deer track that climbed steeply toward the high country. The snow grew deeper as they gained elevation, and soon they were breaking trail through drifts that came up to Eli's knees. Scout seemed to know exactly where he was going, never hesitating at trail junctions, never showing uncertainty about direction. His energy was remarkable for such a young dog. He bounded through the snow with the enthusiasm of an animal half his apparent age, stopping frequently to make sure Eli was keeping up, but never showing signs of fatigue. By late afternoon, they had climbed nearly 3,000 feet, reaching a landscape of bare rock and scattered stands of alpine fir. The view was spectacular, range after range of snow-covered peaks stretching to the horizon, the kind of vista that reminded humans of their proper place in the vast scheme of things. But Scout wasn't interested in the scenery. He continued climbing with single-minded purpose, leading Eli toward a formation of red sandstone cliffs that rose like ancient cathedrals against the sky. As they approached the cliffs, Eli could see that what appeared solid from a distance was actually riddled with caves and crevices, the kind of hidden spaces that the mountains kept secret from all but the most persistent explorers. Scout led him to a narrow opening behind a curtain of icicles, a passage so well concealed that Eli would never have found it on his own. The cave beyond was larger than expected, with smooth walls and a sandy floor that suggested it had been carved by water over countless centuries. And there, in the deepest recesses of the cave, Eli found what Scout had brought him to see. Bones were small and delicate, obviously ancient but remarkably well preserved in the dry mountain air. A dog's skeleton, curled in the sleeping position that all dogs instinctively adopt, with a few scraps of red leather nearby that had once been a collar. The original Scout, who had wandered into this cave during that long-ago blizzard and never found his way home. "Oh, my boy," Eli whispered, kneeling beside the remains of his childhood companion. "You've been here all this time, waiting for someone to find you." Scout, the impossible Scout, who had returned from wherever spirits wait between lives, padded over to sit beside the ancient bones. In that moment, Eli understood what Mary Crow Feather had meant about unfinished business. Scout hadn't just returned to comfort a grieving man. He'd returned to lead Eli to this place, to allow both of them to complete a goodbye that had been interrupted by loss 47 years ago. As if summoned by the magnitude of the moment, the light in the cave began to change. Outside, the aurora borealis was beginning to dance across the northern sky, a phenomenon rarely seen this far south, appearing unseasonably early, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the significance of this reunion. The blessing pouch seemed to grow warm in Eli's pocket, and he knew that the time for final farewells was approaching. Scout's earthly mission was nearly complete, and soon he would need to return to whatever realm housed the spirits of beloved companions who had finished their work among the living. "Thank you," Eli said, addressing both the bones of his childhood friend and the miraculous being who had traveled so far to bring healing to a broken heart. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for teaching me that love really is stronger than death." Scout moved closer, pressing his warm body against Eli's side one last time, and together they sat in the sacred space where past and present converged, waiting for the aurora to light their way toward the most profound goodbye either of them had ever experienced. The aurora grew stronger as night deepened, painting the cave walls in shifting patterns of green and blue light that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. Eli had never seen the northern lights this far south, never witnessed them appearing with such intensity and seeming purpose. The phenomenon was scientifically impossible, yet there it was, dancing across the Montana sky, as if called forth by forces beyond meteorology. Scout moved restlessly around the cave, no longer the playful puppy he'd been during their climb, but something else entirely. His amber eyes reflected the aurora's glow with an inner light that seemed to come from within, and his movements carried a gravity that spoke of approaching transformation. "It's time, isn't it?" Eli asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. The blessing pouch in his pocket had grown warm against his leg, and the very air in the cave seemed charged with the electricity of transition. Scout padded over to where Eli knelt beside the ancient bones and sat down, his body pressed against Eli's side in a gesture of comfort and farewell. For a moment, he was simply a dog again, warm, solid, real, and Eli buried his face in the golden fur, breathing in the familiar scent of pine needles and mountain air. "I understand now," Eli whispered. "You came back to heal my heart, to teach me that love doesn't end with death. But you also came back for yourself, didn't you? To find peace, to finally come home." The aurora pulsed brighter, and in its light, the cave seemed to expand beyond its physical dimensions. The boundaries between past and present, between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond, began to blur like watercolors in rain. Eli reached into his pocket and withdrew the blessing pouch, his hand steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. Inside, the sage and rose quartz felt warm, to the touch, as if they'd been absorbing energy from their sacred purpose. The eagle feather seemed to shimmer with its own light. Following an instinct he couldn't name, Eli placed the rose quartz beside the ancient bones, positioned the sage near Scout's current form, and held the eagle feather aloft as Mary Crow Feather's written instructions had suggested. The words came to him naturally, as if they'd been waiting in his heart for exactly this moment. Great Spirit, source of all love and healing, receive this faithful soul who has completed his earthly work. Let Scout find the peace that has been waiting for him, and let our love bridge the distance between where he's going and where I must stay. The aurora responded to his words with a surge of brilliance that filled the cave with light, so pure it seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the very air between souls. In that radiance, something extraordinary began to happen. The boundary between the living Scout and the ancient bones began to dissolve. Eli could see them both simultaneously, the puppy, who had returned to heal him, and the loyal companion, who had died alone in this cave 47 years ago. They were the same being, the same devoted spirit who had somehow found a way to exist. In 2 moments at once. "My faithful friend," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion, but steady with acceptance. "You've carried this burden for so long, dying alone, wondering if I blamed you for leaving. But it was never your fault. You were just a dog, doing what dogs do, following your instincts, trying to find your way home. I'm the one who left the door unlatched. I'm the one who should have been more careful." Scout, both versions of him, past and present, seemed to shimmer in the aurora light. The ancient bones took on a luminescent quality, while the living puppy became translucent, as if he were being called back to the realm where spirits wait between incarnations. "I forgive you," Eli continued, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he was trying to express. "And I forgive myself. We were both just doing our best with what we knew. We loved each other completely, and that love was perfect even if our circumstances weren't." The cave filled with a sound that was part wind, part music, part the contented sigh of a soul finally laying down a burden it had carried too long. The aurora light began to concentrate around Scout's form, and Eli could see through him now to the cave wall beyond. But the dog's eyes remained fixed on Eli's face with an intensity that spoke of final communications, last messages being passed. Between hearts that had known each other across time and impossible circumstances, in those amber depths, Eli saw forgiveness, gratitude, and a love so pure it made his own heart expand to accommodate its magnitude. "I love you too," Eli whispered. "I always have, and I always will. Go in peace, my friend. Find your rest. You've earned it 1,000 times over." Scout took a step toward the ancient bones, and as he did, both forms began to merge in the aurora, light past and present reuniting, the living spirit finally embracing the physical form it had left behind so many years ago. The reunion was beautiful beyond description, a healing that transcended time and space and touched the very foundations of what it meant to love unconditionally. The aurora reached its crescendo as Scout's transformation entered its final phase. The dancing lights above seemed to descend into the cave itself, creating a bridge of luminescence between the earthly realm and whatever lay beyond. The very air hummed with energy that Eli could feel in his bones, a frequency that resonated with love itself. Scout, no longer fully solid but not yet completely spirit, turned to face Eli one last time. In that moment, the dog seemed to expand beyond his physical form, becoming not just a puppy who had returned to heal a broken heart, but the embodiment of every connection between human and animal, every bond that transcended the boundaries of species and mortality. "Thank you," Scout seemed to say, though no words were spoken. The communication came directly from spirit to spirit, carrying layers of meaning that language could never contain. "Thank you for loving me enough to let me go. Thank you for understanding that this isn't an ending, it's a completion. Eli felt tears streaming down his face, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of profound gratitude and spiritual recognition. "Thank you for coming back," he replied, his thoughts reaching across the aurora light to touch the consciousness that had traveled so far to heal him. "Thank you for showing me that love really is eternal." The aurora pulsed once more, and in that pulse, Scout began his final journey home. His form became increasingly translucent until he was more light than substance, more energy than flesh. But his eyes, those remarkable amber eyes, remained focused on Eli's face until the very last moment, carrying a message of such profound love and peace that Eli felt his own heart transformed to accommodate its vastness. As Scout's spirit merged completely with the ancient bones in the cave, something extraordinary happened. The skeletal remains began to glow with soft, golden light, and for an instant, Eli could see them as they truly were, not the sad remnants of a lonely death, but the sacred vessels that had housed a soul capable of transcending time itself to fulfill a promise of eternal friendship. The light spread outward from the bones to encompass the entire cave, and in that radiance, Eli experienced something that would change him forever. He felt himself connected not just to Scout, but to every being he had ever loved: Sarah, his parents, the countless animals he had helped during his ranger career, even the wilderness itself that had shaped and sustained him throughout his life. The connection was overwhelming in its completeness. Eli understood, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought, that love was indeed the fundamental force of the universe, not just human love, but the love that bound all living things together in an intricate web of care and connection. Every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, every choice to help rather than harm was part of this vast network of loving energy that transcended individual lives and species boundaries. Scout's final gift wasn't just healing the guilt. From childhood, it was revealing the true nature of love itself, love that was patient enough to wait 47 years for the right moment to return. Love that was creative enough to find ways to heal across the boundaries of life and death. Love that was generous enough to sacrifice its own peace for the well-being of another soul. As the aurora began to fade and the supernatural energy in the cave slowly dissipated, Eli found himself alone with the now peaceful remains of his childhood companion. But he wasn't truly alone. He carried within him the absolute certainty that love, once established, never truly ended. It simply found new forms, new expressions, new ways to manifest in the world. The ancient bones no longer glowed, but they radiated a sense of completion that filled the cave with peaceful silence. Scout's long journey was finally over. The loyal spirit who had refused to cross over completely after his death in 1975 had found the closure he needed. The boy who had blamed himself for leaving a door unlatched had finally forgiven himself and been forgiven in return. Eli gathered the bones gently, wrapping them in a spare shirt from his pack. They felt light in his hands, not with the weightlessness of death, but with the lightness of a burden finally lifted. Tomorrow, he would give them the proper burial they deserved, but tonight, they would rest beside him in the cave, where Scout's spirit had finally found peace. As he settled down for the night, using his sleeping bag to create a warm nest in the sacred space, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: complete inner peace. The grief was still there. It would always be part of him, but it no longer dominated his emotional landscape. Instead, it had been transformed into something richer and more complex. A deep appreciation for the preciousness of love in all its forms. The aurora had faded to a faint glow on the horizon, but its message remained burned into Eli's consciousness. Love was the thread that connected all beings across time and space. Death was not the enemy of love. It was simply another transition in love's eternal journey. And sometimes, when the need was great enough and the love was strong enough, souls found ways to bridge even the vast distance between life and death to complete what mattered most. The full expression of their devotion. Scout was finally home. And so was Eli. 3 months later, Eli McCrae stood outside the Whitefish Valley animal shelter, holding a clipboard with adoption papers that represented the beginning of his new life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and somewhere in the building behind him, a chorus of barks and whines spoke of animals waiting for their second chances. The past 12 weeks had brought changes he couldn't have imagined during those dark years of self-imposed isolation. After burying Scout's remains in a peaceful grove near the cabin, marking the spot with a simple stone cairn that caught the morning light, Eli had begun the gradual process of rejoining the world. It started with Dr. Morrison, who listened with remarkable openness as Eli shared carefully edited versions of Scout's story. Helen had connected him with the State University's veterinary program, where his experience with wildlife rescue made him a valuable volunteer. Within a month, he was spending 2 days a week helping with animal rehabilitation programs, using skills he'd developed during his ranger years to care for injured wildlife. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that surprised him. Each animal he helped recover reminded him of Scout's gift, that love could indeed bridge seemingly impossible distances, that healing was always possible when someone cared enough to try. The graduate students appreciated his calm presence with frightened animals, and the professors valued his practical knowledge of wildlife behavior. But it was his brother David's visit in April that had crystallized Eli's understanding of what his new life should look like. David had driven up from Colorado, expecting to find his hermit brother marginally improved, but essentially unchanged. Instead, he'd found a man transformed, not by the absence of grief, but by grief's evolution into something more complex and compassionate. "You're different," David had said on their third evening together, as they sat on the cabin porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold. "You still miss Sarah, I can see that, but you're not hiding from it anymore." "I learned something about love," Eli had replied, thinking of Scout's impossible return and Mary Crowfeather's wisdom about spirits who refused to let distance break their bonds. "I learned that it's stronger than I thought, more persistent, more creative in finding ways to continue." David's response had been to suggest something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "You know, there's a veteran support group in town. Guys who've lost spouses dealing with the transition from military or public service careers. Maybe you'd be interested." The support group had led to other connections, men his age who understood the particular challenges of rebuilding life after losing a life partner, who could appreciate both the necessity of grief and the importance of eventually choosing to live again. Some were further along in their healing journey. Others were just beginning to emerge from their own caves of isolation. It was through this group that Eli had met Tom Harrison, a retired firefighter whose wife had died 2 years earlier. Tom had been volunteering at the animal shelter for 6 months, finding that caring for abandoned pets helped him process his own sense of abandonment and loss. "Dogs don't judge," Tom had explained. "They just need love, and they give it back completely. It's good practice for learning to trust that caring about something won't always end in heartbreak." Now, standing outside the shelter with adoption papers for a 2-year-old golden retriever mix named Sunny, Eli felt the truth of Tom's words. This wouldn't be a replacement for Scout. Nothing could ever replace what Scout had been to him, but it would be something equally valuable, a new beginning, a fresh opportunity to practice the love that Scout had traveled so far to help him understand. Sunny had been surrendered by a family moving overseas, and she carried none of the supernatural mystery that had surrounded Scout's arrival. She was simply a dog in need of a home, and Eli was simply a man ready to provide one. The arrangement was beautifully ordinary, refreshingly normal, and exactly what both of them needed. The adoption process was quick. Eli's references from Dr. Morrison and the university veterinary program had expedited the paperwork. When they brought Sunny out to meet him, She approached with the cautious optimism of an animal who'd learned that humans could disappoint, but hadn't given up hope that some of them might also heal. "She's a sweetheart," the shelter volunteer said as Sonny sniffed Eli's outstretched hand and then sat calmly beside him. "Great with people, good with other animals, house-trained and obedient. She just needs someone who won't give up on her." "I'm not much for giving up," Eli replied, scratching behind Sonny's ears and receiving a gentle tail wag in return. "We'll figure each other out." The drive home was peaceful. Sonny rode in the passenger seat with the calm dignity of a dog who understood that life sometimes offered second chances to those patient enough to wait for them. She watched the mountain scenery with interest, but without the supernatural recognition that Scout had displayed. She was discovering this landscape for the first time, just as Eli was discovering what it meant to love again without the weight of cosmic significance. That evening, as Sonny explored her new home with careful thoroughness, Eli sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and a sense of quiet satisfaction. The mountain silence was no longer the oppressive weight it had been during his years of isolation. It was simply peaceful, filled with the ordinary sounds of wind in pine trees and the distant call of a lark. Sarah's empty chair was still empty, and it always would be. Scout's supernatural presence had passed back into whatever realm housed the spirits of faithful companions. But the love that had defined both relationships lived on in new forms in Eli's renewed connection with his community, in his work with injured animals, in his growing friendship with other men learning to navigate life after loss. Tomorrow, he would return to the university to help with the injured red-tailed hawk that had been brought in over the weekend. Next week, he would host a veteran support group at his cabin for the first time, sharing the peace of the mountains with other souls learning to heal. And every day, he would care for Sonny with the quiet devotion that Scout had taught him was love's most essential expression. As the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, Eli felt a presence that was both memory and blessing. Not Scout himself, that faithful spirit had found his rest, but the echo of every love he'd ever known, reminding him that the heart's capacity for connection was infinite, that every ending was also a beginning, and that the wilderness of grief could be crossed by those willing to trust that love, in all its forms, would always show them the way home.